back to my channel, and in today's video we are going to focus about the subtalar joint function. In previous videos we have already discussed the subtalar joint in detail, and in the last video we had the discussion about the angle joint or talocrural joint biomechanics, where we saw that the angle complex or angle joint, even though it is having dorsiflexion and plantar flexion as the movement, it is in fact a triplanar movement. We saw how the triplanar movement is going to work in the angle joint or talocrural joint. Now what about the subtalar joint? It is in fact a bit complicated than the angle joint or talocrural joint, because you know that it already has three articulations, three articular surfaces. So what will be the motions in the subtalar joint? Let us find out through this discussion, through the most simplified manner, what is the motion in subtalar joint. Yes, when we speak about the subtalar joint, we must take it into consideration that we have three articular surfaces. It is actually between the talus and the calcaneum. The anterior articular surface, as well as the middle articular surface, and a posterior articular surface like this, and a posterior articular surface, right? Three articulations. If we look closely, we see that the anterior and middle articulations are convex in talus, and concave in calcaneum. So that is a convex concave. Whereas if we look at the posterior, we see that it is concave in talus and convex in calcaneum. See the difference? This actually becomes a convex concave and a concave convex. So how can the movement take place? This is a single joint and this works as a single joint axis over here, but for our astonishment, this is exactly reversal. So one place, if anterior and middle is going for lateral rotation or lateral tilt or abduction, the posterior will go for adduction. So how can the movement take place in the angle complex? So that too in the subtalar joint, how can it take place? Any idea? There comes the importance of the triplanar motion. So we see that the subtalar joint is also having a triplanar motion. One of the reasons for that is the axis. One of the reasons for it is these three peculiar articulations. The other reason is the axis, which is an oblique one, which we already know. Because in an angle complex, we have oblique axes rather than normal cardinal axis or cardinal planes. So this reasons makes the subtalar joint motion a difficult one to understand. And we cannot imagine that anterior, middle and posterior will move separately. No. It should happen as a part of a same movement. So there should be some mechanism that should allow movement here and allow movement here. That is something like a screw motion is going to take place in our subtalar joint. Can we examine that? Yes, right. For that, first thing that you need to understand a motion, I always tell, that is you need to understand the axis of motion. What is the axis of subtalar motion? The subtalar motion axis is also an oblique one, and we see we have an oblique axis like this. We have an oblique axis like this, which is oriented about 42 degrees from the transverse plane. This is the transverse plane. So this axis is oriented about 42 degrees from the transverse plane. At the same time, this axis is oriented about 16 degrees from the sagittal plane. 16 degrees from the sagittal plane. This is the sagittal plane. Okay. See the differences if the axis. In fact, if this axis was purely a vertical one, for example, if this axis was a pure vertical one like this, so that would be making that would make the action, the motion in the transverse plane. So it should be the abduction, adduction alone. If the axis was a pure sagittal one, it would have been dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. If the axis was something related to the frontal plane alone, a longitudinal axis passing out like this, then the motion should be inversion, eversion alone, right? The motion should be inversion, eversion alone. But we see that the axis is not one. Axis is not a straight cardinal plane representation, or is not a straight axis. It is an oblique one. So that will have the components in 3 planes. So the components will be there in the 3 planes, that is in the transverse plane, in the frontal plane, and in the sagittal plane. The components of the motion will be there in each of this plane. So that is the unique peculiarity of the subtalar joint axis. So get it in your mind. The subtalar joint axis is 42 degrees from the transverse plane and 16 degrees from the sagittal plane. Of course, we don't focus about how far it is away from the frontal plane. And the motion that takes place in the subtalar joint is, you know that it is a supination and pronation movement. Because supination and pronation is a composite movement. If you remember the first video, you can remember that supination, pronation is a composite movement. It involving dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, abduction, adduction, and inversion, eversion. So the movement that is going to take place in this joint is a composite movement, that is a supination, pronation. Of course, you can see that this is just 16 degrees from the sagittal plane. So that means it's only slightly inclined. So the movement that happens in the sagittal plane, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, will be minimal, like what we had in the angle complex. Angle joint, talocrural joint, we saw that the inversion, eversion component is very minimal because it's just away from, it's slightly away from the transverse plane. So similar to that, the sagittal plane movement will be less. Need not worry about that. Just we need to understand we have an oblique axis and we have 3 articulations. Now let us just explore the movements. When we are about to explore the movements, we have 2 ideal conditions to explore. One is a weight bearing condition and one is a non-weight bearing condition. This is especially because the calcaneum is a weight bearing surface. The calcaneum is one of the most prominent weight bearing surface. And your talus also has a rod, and as it has been the foot. The weight bearing is one of the most important tasks in the foot complex or angle complex. So the biomechanics or the motion that takes place in weight bearing and non-weight bearing will be different. So let us discover about first a simple consideration, that is a non-weight bearing subtalar movement. Non-weight bearing subtalar movement. So the non-weight bearing means your calcaneum is free to move around, right? Your calcaneum is free to move around, and we take the reference point of the movement as the calcaneum. So we identify movement is taking place at the calcaneum instead of any other thing. And the foot and the talus, we consider it as fixed. So the head of the calcaneum is the reference point of the movement of this, which one? The non-weight bearing movements, right? So let us focus on what is happening in non-weight bearing. In non-weight bearing movement, I told you this is a 3-planar motion. Don't forget that. So for example, this is the neutral position of the foot. We have a supination, we have pronation. Supination will improve or increase the medial arch. So the foot will be turned in this manner. That's supination. Here it will have pronation, right? Now imagine your calcaneum is going for supination. So there should be 3 motions that is going to happen. What are the 3 motions? Can you imagine in this situation? Later on we will discuss with the leg example, right? Yes. In this example, if this foot has to go for supination, can you imagine, just to look at here, when this foot has to go for supination, this is adduction, this is abduction. My foot has to adduct. The first one is adduction. You got it right? Yes. The second one is, this is inversion, this is eversion. My foot has to invert my foot has to invert. You got the second one? So that is inversion. And what is this movement? This is plantar flexion. So three possible movements are happening. Three composite movements are working together to produce a single motion around at that oblique axis. What is that? The supination is combined by, you can try this one, supination. We have to turn it this manner. This is a supinated position. So supination is converted by adduction, inversion, inside facing to the midline, inversion, and a bit of plantar flexion. Plantar flexion will be less because this is only 16 degrees from the plane. So we got it. So we got the what is non-weight bearing subtalar supination. Right? Yes. Now what about the non-weight bearing subtalar pronation? I don't have to explain it because it's just the opposite of this. So you're going to pronate your hand like this, or you're going to pronate your foot. So it should go for abduction. This much is, it's not happening. I'm just exaggerating this for your understanding. So this is this one. Abduction is happening, eversion is happening, and dorsiflexion is happening. So the movement will be abduction, eversion, and dorsiflexion. Clear? Abduction, eversion, and dorsiflexion. So this is the two composite movement in non-weight bearing position. That is, a supination is confined or combined by three motions. That is your, what is that? Plantar flexion, inversion, and adduction. Whereas your pronation is combined by three motions. That is the opposite of this: dorsiflexion, eversion, and abduction. So these are the three possible motions that are happening in your ankle complex, or more specifically into the subtalar joint. So your calcaneum is the reference point. How do you examine a patient with that? You can examine the patient in a supine lying or prone lying. Yes, it's better you go for the prone lying of the patient and put the leg out of the couch, and you can see, visualize the motion in the talus, the calcaneum. Especially you can see the calcaneum inversion and eversion. I will show you a diagram of that. Let us examine that with the help of the upcoming diagram. In pronation, you can see that the eversion that is happening at the calcaneum, and you can see that calcaneum is taken as the reference point. Whereas in supination, you can see that inversion is taking place in the calcaneum, and you can see that the foot is turning inside. You can see the angle that is made by the calcaneum over there, and we take in this pronation or supination the calcaneum as the reference point. In this left side you have also, in the right side you have also the neutral position of the foot. So you can compare between this neutral position and the position of a pronation and supination, and thus we can arrive at a conclusion. The pronation is followed by eversion, and supination is followed by inversion of the foot, especially at the calcaneum, which is taken as a reference point. And this is the prone position of a patient with the leg outside the couch. And that creates the difference between pronation, supination, as well as the neutral position of the leg. Yes. So we found out what is happening in non-weight bearing condition, and inversion can be combined or referred to as varus movement, and eversion as a valgus movement. Right? Now it's time to understand what is weight bearing movement in the subtalar joint. Yes, we are going for the weight bearing position. So what is going to happen in the weight bearing position? I tell you that this is going to be a bit tough to digest, but we will go through the easy manner in this. Instead of discussing more into the biomechanics, I will try to give you just a rough picture of what is going to happen. If anybody is interested in learning in depth into that, just approach me through the comment section or through my social media profiles, right? So let us examine what is happening in weight bearing position. So in weight bearing position, you are standing. For example, I am standing in, so this is a weight bearing position. My calcaneum is like this. This is the ground. My calcaneum is this one. My calcaneum cannot go for plantar flexion, and dorsiflexion too. It's limited because the body weight is from up. Okay, so my calcaneum is restricted in the sagittal plane movement. At the same time, my body weight is acting. I cannot go for abduction and adduction alone in the calcaneum. Okay. So the calcaneum can of course go for inversion, eversion. It's possible because it's just a tilting movement. It can invert and revert in this direction. Okay, It's not like a tilting, but for simplification I compare it with a tilting. Okay, so it can move in this direction, that is in the a bit of inversion, a bit of eversion it can do. So in supination and pronation, let me rub this diagram, okay, that's for your understanding. In supination and pronation, in non-weight bearing condition, we saw that supination is followed by, what is happening in supination? It is followed by inversion, it is followed by adduction, and it is followed by plantar flexion. Whereas pronation is followed by the opposite, eversion, the abduction, and dorsiflexion. Here you see that there is a component known as an inversion and eversion. So the inversion and eversion in weight bearing also will take place in our calcaneum itself. So the calcaneum is able to move for that inversion eversion component. But whereas what about the other component? You have to have supination and pronation. If there is a supination and pronation, definitely the other components like adduction, plantar flexion, abduction, dorsiflexion has to take place. Who is going to do that? Whom can we take as a reference? Of course, we can take the other one, subtalar joint. We can take the talus as the reference point. Yes, of course, we'll take the talus as the reference point. So the reference point actually changes here. Okay, the reference point actually changes. We take the reference point as the talus. Right, we take that reference point as the talus, and that too in particular the head of the talus. But articulation is between the body of the talus, neck of the talus with the calcaneum. You should remember that, and then bring out the old conclusion, old discussion. What is that? The anterior and middle joints are convex concave. The posterior joint is concave convex. So this is having reciprocal concave convexity. Right. Now let us imagine this situation in which we have to have the supination. We have to have the supination. So what actually happening is that in supination the primary movement will be inversion, which is provided by your calcaneum. Now we have to have two movements by our talus. Two movements by our talus. The talus is not going to adduct. The talus is not going to adduct. Because you know that the head of the talus is in the superior location like this. For example, if this is the talus, this hand is the talus, and this is the articulation, this lower end is the articulation, wrist is the articulation with the calcaneum. You imagine when I am going for adduction like this, what is happening to this end? It's going for abduction. So supination, should I need adduction or abduction? I need adduction. So what at the calcaneum it should happen. So what is actually happening is that at this moment for supination, imagine this is the foot, your talus, which is the, you can take this knuckles as the talus, the superior knuckles are the talus of the two fingers. So the talus will not go for this movement. If the talus is going for this movement, the arch is going to decrease. The arch is going to decrease. The talus will instead move for abduction. See, the talus will move for abduction. When the talus is moving for abduction, my arch is going to elevate. That is, I am going to have supination over here. So the talus will go for abduction. Exactly opposite of this one. The talus will go for abduction. At the same time, you can imagine when it is going for abduction, what is happening? The talus is getting up or moving in a dorsum to the dorsum of the foot. When it is moving to the dorsum of the foot, what is happening? Is it plantar flexion or dorsiflexion? It is the dorsiflexion. So you see here in supination it is just opposite. Talar abduction and talar dorsiflexion. Oh my god, this is going to be tough. No. This is not actually tough because nobody is going to ask you what is non-weight bearing and weight bearing separately. If you know what is weight bearing, for that in examination, if you are a student, if you are going to write in examination point of view, don't by heart this. You go in this manner, you imagine your hand as the foot in the exam hall. You can just write it down if you know this theory right now. And if you know this, it's very easily you can write the weight bearing because this is just opposite. The inversion is the same. If here it is adduction, here it is abduction. If here it is plantar flexion, here it is dorsiflexion. But that is an easy manner. But if you are a biomechanics and you want to know the theory behind it, remember this is what is happening because here the reference point is your head of the talus. And this reciprocal concave convexity of the joint is going to make the trouble. Right? So what happens is that simply if you can imagine this situation, your talus is going for My talus can go for abduction like this or adduction like this. If it is going for adduction like this, okay, if it is going for adduction like this, what will happen to my arch? It will decrease. Supination is actually increase in the medial arch. Okay, the arch should increase in the medial side. So this should go for abduction. So this goes for abduction. When it is going for abduction, you can see this. When it is going for abduction, it is getting more dorsiflexion. Literally, I'm exaggerating this one, right? So this is going with more dorsiflexion. So what happens? Dorsiflexion happens. If it is going for adduction, it is going down. It is tilting in this direction. That means it is going for plantar flexion. And you remember, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion is only slight, so you cannot even predict or visualize this movement to a great extent. So this is what happens in supination. So what will be happening in the pronation? What will be happening in the pronation in weight bearing? Inversion will be there because it is the calcaneum itself. There is no change in that, right? But the talus is going for adduction, and your talus is also going for what you call plantar flexion. Your talus is also going for plantar flexion. See, this is the beauty of this joint. Is it the beauty or is it getting complicated? That you can decide yourself. But I feel this is a wonderful idea because you have a triplanar motion and you get some complicated biomechanics like this in the foot, which makes foot complex one of the most difficult or most complicated joint. And it's having the complicated function also. Everything happens in the foot, right? Your movements, your dancing, your jumping, everything. It should have some bit of complication, right? Yes, it should not be so simple. Then we might not understand its significance. Right now we cannot discover that, we cannot explore that, so it makes us think that, oh, angle complex is so tough, right? It's whatever it is. So we conclude by saying that this is what is happening in non-weight bearing and weight bearing. The reference point shifts and there is a total alteration in the two basic motion, that is adduction and plantar flexion, whereas the motion inversion remains the same throughout our discussion and throughout the motion. Right? When the foot is in a supinated position, when supination is fixed, we call it like a pes cavus. That means your arch is high. Whereas the foot is in a pronated position, and your arch is low, we call it as a pes planus. Okay, that is a flat foot, and the cave, like the foot curve of the foot or the arch of the foot increases. Arch of the foot decreases. We call it as a flat foot. Now let us examine what is happening in this joint through some real life examples. We are examining what is happening in the weight bearing subtalar joint motions. Okay, you can see from here that this is a weight bearing position, and the subtalar joint supination would be a movement like this. Okay, it won't be this evitable or this evident, but it would be a movement like this. So what is happening? Your calcaneum will go for inversion or eversion, whatever it is. It will go for what you call the supination. It will go for inversion. So what is happening to the dorsum of the foot? You can see here the talus, the area, the dorsum of the foot is actually getting bulged dorsum. It is actually getting bulged to the outside. You can see here, right? You can see that when I go for supination like this, it is going to get bulged. Of course, I'm not standing, I'm sitting and demonstrating this. Okay, don't worry about that. So this part is getting bulged. That means your dorsum of the foot is getting expanded out. That means your talus is going dorsiflexion and abduction in this direction. Whereas in subtalar pronation, you can see this dorsum is getting bulged downwards. It is not going to bulge downwards, and it is in fact going for adduction and a plantar flexion movement, the talus head. But here you can see the difference. The talus head is actually moving outward like this. If you imagine this is the talus head, it will move outward like this. It will move for abduction and it will move for the dorsiflexion. It will move abduction and dorsiflexion. That is a supination, and this is the pronation. Of course, this movement is not this much evident in the weight bearing position. So I hope that is clear for you, and if you have any doubts, as I told you, be free to. With that, we wind up the session on the subtalar joint axis and motion. Next session we might go for the subtalar joint range of motion and few other things. I hope that this was a very simplified lecture, because the joint of subtalar joint, if you go on explanation, it's going to be a vast discussion. Anybody who is interested and crazy to learn biomechanics can just approach me in person. I'll try to solve your queries as far as I can. So if you like this video, don't forget to click the like button, and if you haven't subscribed to our channel, kindly subscribe.